Nostalgia is still an odd experience for me in the years since I talked about it last. I think 2019 was a big year for me as far as feelings of nostalgia were concerned. I can tell you that my opinion might be better informed, but it hasn't changed all that much. I still don't enjoy nostalgia. But what has changed is how I understand it. Back in 2019, I compared nostalgia to a panic attack. Something that blindsided me and left me feeling ambushed by emotions I hadn't felt in years. It was as if the past had collapsed onto the present, compressing time around me until I felt like I couldn't breathe. I didn't have a framework to process it, so I didn't know whether nostalgia was something to embrace or escape. But over the years, I've come to see nostalgia differently. I've studied its history, its purpose, and its consequences. I even presented a research project at university on what I felt was the evolution of nostalgia in the public discourse. And what I've learned is that nostalgia isn't just personal. It's a societal means of framing that can be pathologized, medicalized, popularized, commercialized, and even weaponized. But more than that, I realized that the nostalgia I personally struggle with most isn't about the past. It's about the future, or rather an anticipated future that never arrives. There was a time when nostalgia wasn't seen as an emotion. It was seen as an illness. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Swiss doctors diagnosed it as a form of homesickness so severe that it could lead to death. Soldiers and exiles were particularly vulnerable, as if their longing for what was lost was strong enough to break their bodies. And it makes sense. It can make the present seem hollow, like you're standing outside of your own life watching it from a distance. But by the 19th century, nostalgia had shifted from a physical disease to a psychological condition linked to depression and melancholia and unresolved grief. It was Freud who believed nostalgia was rooted in a longing for what had been lost, a symptom of mourning disguised as memory. But what I've come to understand is that nostalgia isn't always about the past. Sometimes it's about what never happened at all. It's not just a longing for what you had. It's a longing for what you could have had, the future you expected or were led to believe was inevitable given your upbringing or culture, even the person you thought you'd become. And that kind of nostalgia doesn't just creep up on you. It's like a shock to the schema. It subverts the present by arguing that there was a future promised to you by a past lived in anticipation of it. Taken this way, it makes sense that for centuries, nostalgia was something to be feared or cured. Maybe that's why my first experience with nostalgia felt like a panic attack. Because on some level, I sensed the danger of looking back too long. But as society evolved, so did our relationship with it. By the mid-20th century, nostalgia became something more personal. No longer a disease, but a part of the human experience. A bittersweet reminder of what mattered to people who lived through the time before now, even if we didn't know it while it was happening. But nostalgia didn't stop there. It became collective. By the late 20th century, it was no longer just a private feeling. It was everywhere. In cinema, music, and fashion, entire industries have been built around selling us fragments of the past. Nostalgia became something you could consume, and the more we consumed it, the harder it became to separate genuine memory from manufactured sentiment. Once nostalgia became a commodity, it was only a matter of time before it was packaged and sold back to us. Retro brands, reboots, throwback playlists, they're all designed to tap into that emotional circuitry that makes us long for a version of the past that feels safer, simpler, and more meaningful. And the thing is, it works. Because nostalgia feels personal even when it's being mass-produced. It doesn't matter if it's been curated by an algorithm or created by a focus group. It still feels like it belongs to you. But not all nostalgia is organic. Not all nostalgia is yours. And once I understood that, I started questioning whether some of the nostalgia I felt was actually mine or if it was something I'd been taught to feel. Nostalgia started to resemble a conditioned or Pavlovian response depending on the external stimuli exerting itself on my emotions. But nostalgia isn't just a product or the result of a product. It's also an easily weaponized tool that can remove reason and subvert perceptions. Politicians use nostalgia to sell an idealized past that never actually existed. Nationalist movements thrive on the belief that society was better back then, when life was simpler, roles were clearer, and the world made sense. But nostalgia lies. It edits out the parts of history that don't fit the narrative. It turns the past into a myth in much the same way people who peak in high school mythologize the accomplishments of those years. I'm surrounded by men in their 40s and 50s still talking about things they did in the 80s and 90s, like they achieved some world-changing outcome that deserves its own book in the biblical scriptures. That's where nostalgia becomes dangerous, when it stops being a memory and starts becoming a defense mechanism against the present day, by way of the mythology it fosters for the past. By all means, be proud of what you accomplished. You wouldn't be who you are now if you didn't have that foundation to build upon. But if what you do now is less than what you did, then try not to build your entire existence around who you aren't anymore. That's harder to do than most people think, because we do love the smell of our own fumes. But for me, nostalgia isn't about pop culture. It isn't about old TV shows or childhood memories. It's about something deeper, something more difficult to identify and even more so to name. I don't feel nostalgic for the past. I feel nostalgic for a future that never happened. The distance between who I am and who I could have been isn't just a psychological gap. It's an emotional burden. It's the ache of untapped self-actualization, the anxiety of knowing there was more to reach for, but never knowing if it was ever truly within reach. It's mourning the person I could have been, the version of myself that existed in potential but never in reality. And the thing about potential, it doesn't wait. It doesn't care if you were almost there. It doesn't care if you missed a step. It doesn't care if you ran out of time. Potential isn't a promise, it's an opening. And if you don't go through it, eventually it closes. Most of the openings have already closed for me. Maybe some have closed for you too. But nostalgia won't open them again. It can't. Nostalgia is passive. Worse than that, it's pacifying. Time machines to take us to the past don't exist, but one does exist that can take you to the future. It's life, and it only moves forward. As a result, the past doesn't hold much sway for me. Not the things I did, nor the people I did them with. That's why nostalgia doesn't feel quite like the panic attack it did a few years ago. Nostalgia no longer feels like that to me because it's much more of an existential threat than an overwhelming emotional state. I am so firmly ensconced in what is going on around me or what might happen next that the question that comes to mind when I feel nostalgic is rarely, what happened to the good old days and can I go back? I never think back to my childhood or those early years of emerging adulthood and think of them in those terms. I barely consider them beyond what they mean in the context of who I was and how I got here. My nostalgia isn't about the life I lived or the choices I made. What I feel, the existential nostalgia that I seem to experience, is more focused on raising the profoundly distressing question of, what are you going to do with the time that you have left? And worse than the question itself is not knowing the answer. As an odd postscript to all of this, it turns out that through no planning or design on my part, I'm sharing these thoughts exactly 2,000 days after I first discussed nostalgia, a period that seems significant in the context of reflecting on the past and the passage of time. That seems both worthy of note and completely meaningless. There's an elegant symmetry to it, whether it signifies anything or not. I try to subscribe to the belief that we shouldn't actively look for signs, but we also shouldn't ignore them when they seem to present themselves. Is this a sign? Maybe, or maybe not. Maybe time simply moves with more intention than we realize, whether we acknowledge it or even have the sensory fidelity to perceive how it travels. Not everything can be explained through introspection or extrospection, both of which I attempted here. Regardless of its meaning, I know what I've gained, lost, experienced, and avoided in the 2000 days from one temporal signpost to the next. I don't know if I've become who I was supposed to be, apropos of my peculiar form of existential nostalgia, but I do know this: I wouldn't go back.